Australia, where everything wants to kill you, except on the sheep.
When I was around 5-7, I would get constant dead relatives stand over me at night. My mum, sister and I used to live with my granddad as my dad buggered off before I was born. It was a family house and many of my family members died there. It's a really old Queenslander type of high-rise houses here in Australia. Think of a regular 2-story house, but the first floor is an above-ground basement where my granddad lived. A man in green overalls and a lady under my bed were there almost every night, although she was completely silent, but I was still petrified. The man used to stand and browse the old bookshelf in my room right next to the door. He had a grey complexion and would wake me up with humming. If I stayed down or under the covers, he'd continue humming. But somehow, he would know if I was looking and turn and come right up to my bed, lean in and try to get in my face. Completely silent and just stare at me. I'd get so fucking scared I'd get under my covers or scream for my mum. The lady used to let out a faint light from under my bed. I can't remember what she looked like because I was upside down and was in shock whenever I saw her. I didn't want to dangle there for as long as we locked eyes, but I did check what the light was a few times, and whenever I'd look under the bed, it felt like the entire room was watching me. Later on, my mum concluded it sounded like my granddad's uncle, as that was his room that he died in. When I saw the pictures, it was 100%. My mum said that maybe he was there to protect me, and I shouldn't worry about it, but it felt very evil. Just before we moved, my mum screamed at them to leave me alone at like 3 a.m. I don't know what the neighbours may have thought, but it must have worked. He came back a few times afterwards, but never approached me. After we moved out into our own place, my granddad's brother moved in with him. Years later, he died in the same room. I sometimes visit, as it is the family house, but fuck me, I never stay in that room. It makes me feel horrible just walking past it. This is the first time I've publicly spoke of this story. So I was about 15 and living with my parents on their farm in Australia. The farmhouse is close to 100 years old. I have always had trouble sleeping in the house, recurring dreams of being abducted by aliens, seeing things dart around in the corner of my eyes, but nothing concrete. One night whilst it was only my father and I home, I was in the computer room up late playing Happy Hotel of all things. The door to the small box-like room was closed. The door leads to a sort of foyer, and then there is another door to the main house, roughly 15 feet from where I was sitting. I heard the door to the main living area open up, and a male voice explained to me to keep this door open. The voice didn't sound particularly remarkable by any stretch, and given the time of night and my exhaustion levels, hearing a generic male voice, I assumed it was my father, the only other person home. I calmly got up from the computer desk and made my way to the door. All of 5-6 seconds after I was spoken to. To my shock, there was nobody there. Perplexed, I decided to head into my father's room and ask what all the fuss was about. Now, my father is a notoriously light sleeper, to the point where, if he stirs in the night, he will usually get up and start his day, no matter the time, as he will not return to slumber. As I walked in, I expected to find him staring at the ceiling trying to sleep. I calmly asked what's the story. To my shock, he was out like a light, totally soundly asleep. My heart sank and my spine went cold. I was in a pitch black 100-year-old farmhouse, with something trying to speak to me. Once I gained the courage to speak to my parents about this, they actually opened up like a book of lots of other incidents they have encountered whilst living under this roof. So basically, when the subject was brought up with my parents, they spilled the beans. They've been having experiences for years, and while my dad has always been fairly open-minded about this sort of thing, my mum is very much a skeptic. Well, that is what I believed. Mum told a story of waking up with a ghostly female figure floating above the bed. Another night, walking down our long hallway at some ungodly hour to the bathroom, only to be physically blocked, like she ran into a wall in the middle of the walkway, or a physical resistance. Once she tried to walk again, she was free to do so. The one that I find particularly disturbing is Dad recalling the events of one particular night. It was another weekend where the rest of my family were away competing with their horses. I was young, around 7 or so I would say. Occasionally, when this would happen, Dad and I would sleep out in the fold-out futon and watch the motorcycle racing. On this particular night, Dad recalls being awoken in the middle of the night to a noise in my little sister's room. There was still nobody else home. He heard the sound of her toys being played with, not violently, but moved around and fiddled with. These types of noises are extremely noticeable at 2 o'clock in the morning in an empty farmhouse. It is like pure dread in your stomach. I think I may be a bit of an empath, judging by the experiences I've had over the last 50 odd years. My husband Jay, however, is a skeptic. He says he would love to see a ghost but doesn't expect to. He once took part in a study at university, one of those classic guess what card I'm holding up experiments. This was in the 70s. Jay got so many wrong, it was statistically significant in the negative direction. He says that proves there's no such thing. I think it indicates the opposite. I believe he actively blocks his own abilities to the point where he negates the paranormal around him. Being around him is like wearing psychic earplugs. It's very soothing. The following occurred in the early 80s, when we were at university in northern New South Wales, Australia. Most of the students lived on campus, and the uni had its own radio station to cater to them. A friend of ours, G, was a DJ at the time and had a midnight till dawn weekend shift. She invited us up to the station one night to tape some albums from the station's record collection. The radio station was located in a faculty building about a 20-minute walk from the college where we all lived. G had the keys and locked all doors behind us. The station consisted of 2 rooms. A large rectangular room housing an office area with 2 glass-walled studio booths partitioned off on one long side, and a storage room housing the library. The entrance door was in the long wall opposite Studio A. The door to the library was in the short wall next to Studio B. Other than the library, the entire area is visible from either of the 2 studios. G commenced her shift, using Studio B while Jay set up in Studio A with some blank cassette tapes, and I headed into the library to pick some albums. The record library was fantastic. 4 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelving, packed solid with classic rock LPs. I was standing on a chair choosing some music from the top shelf when I started feeling that there was someone or something behind me, almost but not quite touching me. I was telling myself not to turn around. There's nothing there. But the feeling got so strong that I really wanted to get my back against the wall. I have personal space issues, and the sensation of anything being that close was just too much for me, and I had to get out of there. I grabbed a couple of records, took them to Jay, to then walk and talk to G in Studio B. From where I was sitting, facing G, who had her back to the main room, I could see the entire radio station. Jay was in the studio to my right. The main door was diagonally to my right, The one and only door to the record library was diagonally to my left, all clearly visible through the glass walls of the studio booths. I watched Jay get up, leave Studio A, walk across the office space from right to left behind G, and enter the record library. As he disappeared into the library, a figure in blue came out of the library door, crossed rapidly from left to right behind G, and entered Studio A. I turned my head to look directly into Studio A. There was no one there. About 15 minutes later, Jay came out of the record library and walked back to Studio A. Immediately, the blue figure shot out of Studio A, crossed behind G, and went back into the library. G must have seen my eyes following it because she said quite excitedly, "You saw it, didn't you? I knew if there really was something here, you'd know." It turns out G had been feeling she wasn't alone up there at night, and having heard some of my experiences, she decided to try an experiment. She kept her experiences to herself, then waited to see if I picked up on anything. Gee, thanks, G. It also turns out that while Jay ain't afraid of no ghost, the ghosts are afraid of him. This happened around a year ago, but I've never really shared this story except with some doctors, as my parents thought I might be developing psychosis. But the doctors confirmed that wasn't it. So around a year ago, I had to walk up to my bus stop, and given my bus leaves very early, I had to leave around 6 a.m. Since it was winter, I'm in the southern hemisphere, it was still pitch black outside. There may have been a very faint light, but I can't really remember. I live out on a country back road, so there is no one else anywhere near me. And there would be no one else walking on the road at that time. I'd also walked along this road at 2-3 a.m. several times, with everything normal. But this time, I only got to the end of my driveway, where just as I was entering the road, I saw a dark figure walking along the road. Given that there would be no one else out around this time, I was terrified. I tried to grab their attention by saying hello, but they just continued on. I was still terrified, so I got out my phone and shone my torch on them. But the second I did that, they just disappeared. And that was enough for me, so I noped right the fuck out of there. I started walking backwards towards my house, too scared to turn around, and as I did, the figure came back into view again. It started following me back toward the house. And as it did, it started growing taller. Its arms and legs became extremely long, and it continued to chase me back until I got inside again. I haven't experienced anything similar since then, and it was just a one-off thing. There wasn't anything I could have possibly been creating the illusion of a person, such as a pole or something. And I know what I saw. I ended up getting my mum to drive me to my bus stop instead, as I was far too scared to go outside and walk down there again. That's all there was to the encounter, but there's some other things worth mentioning, things I should probably note. This was a one-off encounter. I've never experienced or seen anything similar before or since. In the weeks following the encounter, at night, I heard two people conversing, but couldn't make out any words, whilst I was either the only one at home or everyone was asleep. It was ruled out by the doctor that it was a psychosis or something similar. When I encountered it, I immediately had the most fear I'd ever felt before, but I wasn't frozen in place and could still move. I also felt a general sense of dread, common with stickman sightings. It seemed to have multiple sides but be 2D, like a sprite from an old Doom game, not pixelated though. It was dead silent when I saw it, but I think I may have heard it walking. It was not gliding. I could see it bobbing slightly as it walked. It did not look at me until I started retreating, when it was staring at me and coming towards me fast. It had no facial features of any sort. I didn't remember any air illusions around it that I can remember. It seemed more bulky than a normal stickman. It was more like what you would see on a bathroom male-female sign. For a few weeks after the encounter, I heard people walking around my house, changing from walls to ceiling to floor. This wasn't rats or anything. It was definite human footsteps. I was fully awake and alert at the time. I didn't get the sense that I shouldn't be seeing it or anything. If anything, it more felt like I was meant to see it. I know what I saw, and that it was real and not an illusion from the light or anything else. That's all I can think of right now. I still have no possible way of explaining it. Does anyone know what it could be? This is by far the spookiest experience my family and I have had regarding the paranormal. This is a long story, so I hope you find this interesting enough to read it till the end. I am currently living in Australia, and this all started when I moved into my current house around 3 years ago. In my culture, we believe that whenever a family moves into a new house, a priest should come to perform various prayers to bless the house. However, when my mum bought the house, we immediately went on holiday for 3 months, so we were unable to perform the rituals. Everything started when we first came back to our house. Just some background, my mum raised me on her own, so it was just the two of us staying in the house at the time. I was still in high school, and my mum worked in the city, so we both took the train every morning. My mum always left home earlier than me, so it was my job to lock up every morning. My mum worked late almost every day, so I would get home first and be home alone for at least 5 hours every day. One morning as I left home, I began to feel paranoid that I had not locked the door, so I walked back to check it. The door was locked. Later that day, when I came home from school, I walked up my driveway to find that the door was wide open. I freaked out, but I was brave enough to go inside. Our kitchen is pretty close to the entrance, so I grabbed a knife and searched the entire house. There was no one there. I decided not to tell my mum because she was really stressed with work, and I did not want her to freak out. Over the next few days, another strange thing started happening. Our garage door would start randomly opening whenever we were home. My mum was kind of scared, but then we thought maybe our neighbor's garage remote functioned at the same frequency or something, and it was activating our door too. So we dismissed it. It had been about 2 months since we were living in our new house, and everything seemed to be normal again. Until one day when I was awoken in the middle of the night by my mum. She looked super scared and asked me if I had come to her room to wake her up. I said no. I was half asleep and had no idea what she was rambling on about. She didn't believe me and made me swear that I hadn't. I always play scare pranks on my family, so that was why. I swore I didn't and asked her what was up. My mum is a super light sleeper, and so while she was sleeping, she heard someone prop her door open. She looked up and saw the figure of a boy and thought it was me. She asked what's wrong and blinked. There was nothing there, and her door was still open. She called my name a few times, and there was no response, hence why she came to my room. I have to admit, given the stuff happening with the doors, I was kinda scared. But I convinced my mum that she was imagining things, and she went back to sleep. Ever since that night, up until this day, my mum still sleeps with her door open and the living room light on, and I do not blame her after what happened next. 2 weeks after this incident occurred, my mum's best friend and her son and daughter, they were both around my age, came over from our homeland, Malaysia, to visit us. I was really excited as I have always been close to them. One thing you should know about my aunt, she's had many experiences growing up with the paranormal, and so she is super scared of ghosts. For this reason, me and her kids always used to play pranks on her. One day the 4 of us were playing poker on the dining table, while my mum was taking a nap in the living room. Suddenly, my mum rushes out of the living room. Her eyes were wide open and she looked really scared. She asked who had woken her up from her nap. The four of us were dumbfounded, as we had been playing cards the entire time. She then told us that she felt someone tap her shoulder while she was asleep. When she opened her eyes, there were 2 feet on the floor. Once again, she blinked and the feet were gone, and there was no one there. My mum was full on freaking out now, especially after what happened the other night. Then my aunt, given how afraid she is of ghosts, started to freak out too. I didn't want her holiday to be ruined, so I managed to convince them that my mum was probably in the middle of a dream. So when she woke up, she was probably hallucinating. Yes, I know it sounds stupid, but hey, it worked. But then the next day, something else happened. My mum had gone to the shops to get groceries. The kids and I were playing video games in the living room, while their mum was having a shower. Suddenly we hear the bathroom door burst open, and out runs my aunt, wrapped in her towel. She screamed at us, telling us to stop trying to scare her and that it wasn't funny. The 3 of us were super confused, and her daughter asked her what had happened. She told us that she knew that we were the ones knocking on the bathroom door, even after she told us to stop 3 times. I know it probably seems like she was overreacting, but I cannot emphasize how scared she is of ghosts. I exchanged a concerned look with her kids, and then told her that it genuinely was not us, and that we were playing FIFA the entire time. Soon my mum got home and we told her what happened. Let's just say that my aunt started sleeping with her room lights on for the rest of her trip. Soon my aunt and her kids had gone home, and it was back to me and my mum again. We were back to our regular routine. My mum was finally at peace, and she had not seen anything for a while, apart from the garage door opening on its own every once in a while. The same, however, could not be said for me. It seemed that it had come my turn to be tormented. As I mentioned before with my mum at work, I would be home alone for a few hours every day. I began to start hearing things. The strange thing is, it would never occur while I was in the living room. Whenever I went to use the toilet or went to sit in my room, I would start hearing things coming from the living room and kitchen. It started out small, just the sound of some panting, like if you had run a marathon, that kind of panting. But the minute I entered the living room, nothing. There would be no sound at all. It soon started to get worse. I would hear footsteps pacing around outside my room and spoons and pots falling in the kitchen. But every time I step out into the living room, the noises would stop, and everything would be just as I left it. There was even a time when I thought I heard a kid laughing right outside the door when I was in the toilet. I decided not to tell my mum yet because she seemed to be getting over her experiences, and I did not want to scare her again. But one day, I felt that I needed to tell her, and we decided that day it was time we contacted our priest to perform the prayers for our house. It was the day my best friend and his parents came over for dinner. It all started as an innocent dinner. My best friend and his family were Malaysian too, and we were having a great time talking about home while having a signature Malaysian meal. My friend's dad was telling us a story, when all of a sudden, his face just froze, and his eyes widened. He honestly looked like he was having a stroke. His face contorted into a frown, and he just stared down at the table. My mum and I shared a worrying look, but my friend and his mum just continued eating like nothing was happening. Suddenly his dad seemed to return to us, and he continues telling the story as if nothing happened. But he could see that my mum and I looked worried. Suddenly his wife tapped his shoulder and said, "Just tell them." He frowned at his wife and just kept eating. There was an awkward silence for a few minutes, and then he finally decided to address the elephant in the room. He apologized for scaring us and assured us that there was no need to worry. He then went on to tell us about his life. Since he was a child, he had been very religious, and from a young age, he felt a very close connection to God. He regularly meditated and was very, very spiritual. He was so spiritual that when he was in his mid-20s, he had awoken a gift. He was able to see dead people. I kid you not. When he said this, I immediately looked at my friend waiting for him to start laughing at some prank. But my friend's face was dead serious, and he continued looking at his dad as he told his story. He told us that he could see them everywhere. When he walks his dog in the street, when he is sitting in the park, in people's houses, and even sometimes sitting on people who had been possessed. He said the spirits were drawn to him because they knew he could see them, and they would stalk him, begging him to help them reach the afterlife. He said there was simply nothing he could do, because these people had died before their time and they would simply have to wait on Earth until it was their time. Back home, he was regularly contacted by people having paranormal experiences to perform a cleansing to drive evil spirits away. He told us about some of these experiences, but I do not feel like this is my place to share them here. He then asked us something that gave me chills. Have you guys performed prayers for your house yet? My mum refused to answer the question until he told her why he had asked that. He said that he did not want to worry us, and that if we hadn't, we probably should. My mum continued to ask him why, until he finally conceded. This is what he said. Remember, when I had that moment just now, while I was talking, I had a visit. I won't tell you what it was, but it was the same spirit I saw standing at the front door when we came here. That's when my mum told him everything that had been happening. It is during this time that I decided to tell my mum about the things I had been hearing in the house. My friend's dad then told us that he did not think it was a malicious spirit, but to be safe, it was time for us to conduct the prayers for the house. Before he left, he asked my mum if he could see our altar in the prayer room. My mum took him to it, and we all followed him. As he stood in front of the altar, his body suddenly shook, as if he just had a huge hiccup. He then put his hands together and bowed his head. Before leaving, he said, "I can see why the two of you have not been hurt. You are both protected." That concluded their visit. A week later, we arranged for a priest from our local temple to cleanse and bless our home. I promise you that ever since that day, nothing strange has ever happened in our house. Even the garage door has stopped opening on its own. I am not a particularly religious person, but I have learned my lesson. I will never move into a new house without performing the rituals that my culture demands. Hello watchers and listeners. If you enjoyed that video, please hit the like button, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing. A huge thank you to all the Reddit users who allowed me to use their stories. Links to each story will be in the description below. If you have any stories you would like to share on my channel, please send them to my email, which is also in the description below. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who continues to support me. I really do appreciate it. Stay safe.